You ever hear words that don't just hurt? They rewrite your entire existence? Words so venomous, so calculated, that they make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself as a mother? I'll never forget the moment he looked at me across that sterile conference room, his lawyer beside him like a vulture, and said with a smile that could freeze hell, "Face it, Elena. You're an unfit mother. Our son deserves better than someone like you." The room went silent, except for the sound of my heart shattering. But here's what he didn't know. What none of them knew was that our 12-year-old son Marcus was about to walk into that courtroom 3 months later and tell a truth so powerful, so undeniable, that even the judge had to pause and collect himself. And when Marcus finished speaking, my ex-husband's perfect facade crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and I'm a nurse, a mother, and a woman who spent 5 years being told I wasn't enough. I'm 32 years old, born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona, where the desert heat teaches you that survival isn't just about enduring. It's about finding strength in the most barren places. My mother, Carmen, cleaned office buildings for 20 years to put me through nursing school. She never spoke perfect English, but she spoke perfect love, and she taught me that your worth isn't measured by what others think of you, but by how you show up for the people who need you most. I met Daniel Carlisle when I was 26, working the night shift at Phoenix General Hospital. He was a pharmaceutical sales rep, all charm and expensive suits, the kind of man who could sell ice to Eskimos and make them thank him for it. He had this way of walking into a room like he owned it, confident in that effortless way that comes from never having to prove yourself to anyone. When he first approached me during my break, I was exhausted, my scrubs wrinkled, my hair falling out of its ponytail, and somehow he made me feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. Daniel was everything my mother had warned me about, and everything I thought I wanted. He drove a BMW that smelled like leather and success. He took me to restaurants where the menus didn't have prices, and the wine cost more than my weekly paycheck. He made me feel sophisticated, chosen, like I had finally made it out of the neighborhood where broken dreams went to die. He was older, established, with a corner office and a downtown condo that looked like something out of a magazine. Our first date lasted until sunrise. We sat on the balcony of some rooftop bar, talking about everything and nothing, and when he looked at me, I felt seen in a way I never had before. He told me about his childhood in Connecticut, boarding schools and country clubs, a world so different from mine it might as well have been another planet. I told him about my mother's sacrifices, about working 2 jobs to pay for school, about choosing nursing because I wanted to help people heal. He said it was admirable, that my compassion was rare. Back then, I thought he meant it. 6 months later, I moved into his condo. It was like stepping into a different life, one where everything was clean lines and neutral colors, where the refrigerator was always stocked with expensive cheese and wine I couldn't pronounce. Daniel liked having me there, liked showing me off to his colleagues at company parties. "This is Elena," he'd say, his hand on the small of my back. "She saves lives for a living." It felt good to be his prize, his beautiful nurse girlfriend who proved he was more than just another corporate shark. A 1.5 years in, I got pregnant. We weren't trying, but when I saw those 2 pink lines, I felt something I'd never experienced before, pure, overwhelming love for someone I hadn't even met yet. When I told Daniel, his reaction was measured, calculated. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and said all the right things. We'd make it work. We were ready for this. But something in his eyes had already started to shift, like he was doing math in his head and didn't like the numbers he was seeing. The pregnancy was rough. Morning sickness that lasted all day, exhaustion that felt like drowning, and Daniel's increasing absence from our life together. He had more client meetings, more business trips, more reasons to be anywhere but home with his pregnant girlfriend who could barely keep food down. When I had to cut back my hours at the hospital, he made comments about money, about responsibility, about how children changed everything. Not in a bad way, he'd always add quickly, but the damage was already done. Marcus was born on a Tuesday morning in October, 7 pounds and 3 ounces of absolute perfection. When they placed him in my arms, I understood for the first time what people meant when they talked about unconditional love. This tiny human was mine to protect, mine to nurture, mine to love with every fiber of my being. Daniel held him for exactly long enough for the photographer to take a picture, then spent the rest of our hospital stay on conference calls in the hallway. The first year was a blur of sleepless nights and Daniel's growing resentment. He complained about the crying, about the mess, about how I was always tired, always distracted, always choosing the baby over him. I tried to explain that this was what having a child meant: sacrifice, adjustment, putting someone else's needs first. But Daniel had never put anyone's needs before his own, and he wasn't about to start with a screaming infant who had ruined his perfectly organized life. I went back to work when Marcus was 4 months old, pumping milk in storage closets during my breaks, rushing home between shifts to feed him and hold him and breathe in that perfect baby smell that made everything else fade away. Daniel hired a nanny, expensive, professional, someone who could maintain his lifestyle while I worked myself to exhaustion trying to be everything to everyone. The cracks in our relationship became chasms. Daniel started working later, traveling more, finding excuses to be anywhere but home. When I confronted him about it, he turned it around on me. I was paranoid, hormonal, too focused on the baby to be a good partner. "You've lost yourself, Elena," he'd say, like it was a tragedy instead of transformation. "You used to be fun, spontaneous. Now you're just a mother." The way he said "just a mother" made my blood boil, as if the most important job in the world, raising a human being, shaping a soul, being someone's entire universe, was somehow beneath him. As if the 18-hour shifts I worked to help pay for his lifestyle weren't enough. As if waking up 3 times a night to feed our son, changing diapers with a smile even when I was running on 2 hours of sleep, wasn't worthy of his respect. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When Marcus turned 2, Daniel started staying out all night. Business dinners that ended at breakfast, conferences that happened on weekends when I knew for a fact his company wasn't having any conferences. I found receipts for restaurants I'd never been to, charges for hotels in our own city. When I asked about them, he had answers for everything. Clients who needed entertainment, last-minute meetings that ran late, colleagues from out of town who needed places to stay. I wanted to believe him because the alternative was too horrible to imagine. This was the father of my child, the man I'd built a life with, the person who was supposed to love and protect our family. But love doesn't make you stupid, and I knew what I was seeing. The distant looks, the phone calls he took in other rooms, the way he recoiled when I tried to touch him, like I was contaminated by motherhood and he might catch it. The breaking point came on Marcus's 3rd birthday. I had planned a small party, just family, a few friends, nothing elaborate but filled with love. I made his favorite cake from scratch, decorated the living room with balloons, invited my mother, and cousins, even Daniel's parents who barely tolerated me. Daniel showed up 2 hours late, reeking of perfume that wasn't mine. His shirt wrinkled in ways that told a story I didn't want to read. Marcus ran to him with pure joy, the way children do when they see their heroes. "Daddy, you missed the cake." Daniel picked him up, but I could see the effort it took, like our son was a prop in a play he was tired of performing. When Marcus asked if Daddy was staying for presents, Daniel checked his watch and said he had another meeting. That night, After everyone had gone home and Marcus was asleep, surrounded by new toys and still wearing his birthday crown, I confronted Daniel one last time. I didn't yell or cry or beg. I simply asked him to tell me the truth about where he'd been, who he'd been with, whether he wanted to be part of our family, or if we were just obligations he was trying to escape. His answer was worse than I'd imagined. He didn't deny the affairs, plural. He didn't apologize for missing his son's birthday or for the months of lies and manipulation. Instead, he looked at me like I was naive for expecting anything different. "This is who I am, Elena. I tried to be the family man, but it's not me. You knew that when we met." I stared at him, this stranger wearing my partner's face, and realized I had never really known him at all. The man I'd fallen in love with had been a performance, a carefully crafted character designed to get what he wanted. And what he'd wanted was someone to play house with until he got bored. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Now we figure out what's best for Marcus," he said, and something in his tone made my stomach drop. "I've been thinking about custody arrangements." The way he said it, cold, clinical, like he was discussing a business transaction, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about what was best for our son. This was about Daniel wanting to maintain control, to have access to Marcus when it was convenient while minimizing his own responsibility. Over the next few weeks, Daniel's true nature emerged like a poisonous flower blooming in darkness. He moved out without ceremony, taking his expensive clothes and his expensive car, and leaving behind only the furniture that was too heavy to move easily. He set up in a downtown loft that looked like a bachelor pad from a men's magazine, all glass, and steel and zero evidence that a child might ever visit. When I filed for divorce, Daniel's lawyers came out swinging. Suddenly, I wasn't the devoted mother who had sacrificed everything for her family. I was unstable, emotional, too young and inexperienced to provide proper care for a child. They painted a picture of me as someone who worked too much, earned too little, and lived in a neighborhood that was beneath Marcus's standards. The custody battle began with mediation sessions that felt like psychological warfare. Daniel sat across from me in his perfectly pressed suits, flanked by attorneys who charged more per hour than I made in a week, and systematically dismantled every aspect of my character. I was too emotional, too attached, too focused on my son to see what was really best for him. I lived in an apartment instead of a house, worked nights instead of days, didn't have the resources to provide the kind of opportunities Marcus deserved. His star witness was his mother, Patricia Carlisle, a woman who had never liked me and made no effort to hide it. She testified that I was overwhelmed, that she'd seen me cry during family gatherings, that I seemed unable to handle the pressures of single motherhood. She painted a picture of a woman on the verge of breakdown, someone who clung to her child out of desperation rather than love. The worst part was how they twisted my strengths into weaknesses. My dedication to nursing became evidence that I put my job before my family. My close relationship with my mother became proof that I couldn't make decisions independently. The fact that I'd learned Spanish at home became a concern about Marcus's exposure to non-English influences. They made my love for my son sound like an obsession, my fight for our family sound like selfishness. Through it all, Marcus was caught in the middle, a pawn in a game he was too young to understand. Daniel exercised his temporary visitation rights with the precision of a man checking boxes on a list. He'd pick Marcus up exactly on time, return him exactly on schedule, and report back to his lawyers about every perceived slight or inadequacy he observed. I watched my happy, outgoing little boy become quiet and withdrawn. He started asking questions I didn't know how to answer. Why didn't Daddy live with us anymore? Why did he have to go to Daddy's house if he wanted to stay home? Why did the lady with the clipboard keep asking him who he liked better? The court-appointed child psychologist was Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a woman in her 50s who wore her authority like armor and seemed determined to remain impartial to the point of coldness. She interviewed Marcus multiple times, observed him with both parents, and took notes that would help determine his future. I tried to remain hopeful, but Daniel's lawyers had done their homework on her too. They knew she favored structured environments and traditional family models, that she was more likely to recommend custody arrangements that provided stability over emotion. As the court date approached, I felt like I was watching my life dissolve in slow motion. Daniel's legal team had built a compelling case for why he was the better choice. Higher income, stable housing, flexible schedule, family support system. On paper, he looked like the ideal father. In reality, he was a man who had never changed a diaper, never stayed up all night with a sick child, never sacrificed anything for anyone but himself. The night before our final hearing, I sat in Marcus's room watching him sleep, memorizing the curve of his cheek, the way his hand curled under his chin, the sound of his breathing that had been my lullaby for 3 years. I thought about all. The bedtime stories, the middle-of-the-night cuddles, the scraped knees I'd kissed better, the proud moments I'd celebrated, the fears I'd soothed away. If love was enough, there would be no question about where Marcus belonged. But love wasn't what they were measuring in that courtroom. My lawyer, Sarah Chen, was good, but outgunned. She worked for a small family practice and charged what I could afford, which meant she was fighting Daniel's team of specialists with a fraction of their resources. She'd done her best to present my case, my stability, my devotion, my deep understanding of Marcus's needs. But we both knew we were fighting an uphill battle against money and perception. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Sarah told me the night, "before court, remember that being a good mother isn't about what you can afford to give him. It's about what you choose to sacrifice for him, and you've already proven that 1,000 times over." I tried to take comfort in her words, but fear had settled in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. What if the judge couldn't see past Daniel's shiny exterior to the hollow man underneath? What if Marcus ended up in a house that looked perfect, but felt empty? What if all my love, all my sacrifice, all my fighting wasn't enough to keep my son? The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully in the one good suit I owned, a navy blue ensemble my mother had helped me buy for job interviews years earlier. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a woman who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, scarred but unbroken. Whatever happened in that courtroom, I would face it with dignity. I owed that to my son, to my mother, to myself. Marcus hugged me extra tight that morning, sensing the tension even though I'd tried to shield him from it. "I love you, Mommy," he whispered into my neck, and I held him like I could absorb those words into my soul, store them up for whatever darkness was coming. As I walked into that courthouse, I had no idea that my 3-year-old son, my baby, my heart walking around outside my body, was about to become my voice when mine had been silenced. I had no idea that all those bedtime conversations, all those honest answers to his impossible questions, all those moments when I chose truth over comfort, were about to save us both. The truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it, through the most unlikely messengers. And sometimes, just sometimes, love really is enough, especially when it speaks through the innocent wisdom of a child who knows the difference between being wanted and being truly loved. The courtroom felt like a cathedral of judgment, all dark wood and high ceilings that seemed designed to make you feel small. I sat behind the plaintiff's table in my navy suit, hands folded to keep them from shaking, watching Daniel across the aisle in his charcoal gray ensemble that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He looked relaxed, confident, like a man who had never doubted the outcome of anything in his life. His legal team shuffled papers with the efficiency of people who knew they held all the winning cards. Judge Margaret Thornfield presided from her bench like a stern but fair deity, her silver hair pulled back in a bun that had probably looked exactly the same for 20 years. She had a reputation for being thorough, methodical, and utterly unmoved by emotional appeals. Sarah had warned me that Judge Thornfield valued facts over feelings, structure over sentiment. She would decide Marcus's future based on what looked best on paper, not what felt right in the heart. The proceedings began with Daniel's attorney, Marcus Steinberg, a man whose name alone commanded respect in family law circles. He stood with the kind of confidence that came from never having lost a case like this, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights as he outlined why his client deserved primary custody of Marcus Rodriguez Carlisle. "Your Honor," Steinberg began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "We're here today because a child's future hangs in the balance. My client, Mr. Daniel Carlisle, has worked tirelessly to provide stability, security, and opportunity for his son. He has an established career in pharmaceutical sales with a six-figure income, a home in Scottsdale's premier gated community, and the support of his extended family who have been pillars of this community for generations." As Steinberg spoke, he painted a picture of Daniel that I barely recognized. In his version, Daniel was a devoted father who had tried to make an impossible situation work with a woman who was, tragically, unprepared for the responsibilities of motherhood. I was portrayed as someone who loved Marcus but lacked the emotional maturity and financial resources to provide what a growing boy needed. "Ms. Rodriguez is a fine person," Steinberg continued, his tone suggesting anything but good intentions cannot replace stability. She works erratic hours as a night shift nurse, leaving her son in the care of neighbors and relatives. She lives in a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where police sirens are more common than ice cream trucks. Most concerning, Your Honor, is her emotional volatility. She has been observed crying during family gatherings, losing her temper when frustrated, and displaying the kind of instability that suggests she may not be equipped to handle the pressures of single parenthood. I felt my cheeks burn as he methodically dismantled everything I thought made me a good mother. My tears during family dinners, caused by Daniel's public humiliations, became evidence of mental instability. My small apartment became proof of inadequacy rather than evidence of how I'd stretched every dollar to create a loving home. My night shifts, which I'd chosen specifically so I could be with Marcus during the day, became proof that I prioritized work over family. Steinberg called his witnesses one by one, each testimony a carefully crafted missile aimed at my character. Daniel's mother, Patricia, took the stand in a Chanel suit that cost more than my car, her testimony delivered with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every word. "I've been concerned about Elena's parenting from the beginning," Patricia said, her voice carrying just the right note of reluctant honesty. "She seems overwhelmed by the simplest tasks. I've seen her struggle to get Marcus dressed for family events, become frustrated when he won't eat his vegetables, raise her voice when he's being a normal, active child. During our last Christmas gathering, she actually took him to another room because she said he was overstimulated, but it seemed more like she was the one who couldn't handle a normal family celebration." What Patricia didn't mention was that Marcus had been overwhelmed by the chaos of her sterile mansion, surrounded by adults who treated him like an expensive accessory rather than a child. I had taken him to a quiet room so he could decompress, reading him stories and letting him play with simple toys instead of the elaborate, age-inappropriate gifts his grandmother had insisted on buying. But in Patricia's version, my sensitivity to my son's needs became evidence of my inadequacy. Daniel took the stand next, and I watched in horror as he transformed into the world's most caring father. Gone was the man who had missed more bedtime stories than he'd read, who had never learned the name of Marcus's pediatrician, who had to be reminded about parent-teacher conferences and vaccination schedules. In his place stood a devoted parent who spoke eloquently about his son's needs, his hopes for Marcus's future, his deep concern about the instability in my home. "I love Elena," Daniel said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine regret. "But love isn't enough when it comes to raising a child. Marcus needs structure, consistency, opportunity. He deserves to grow up in a home where he doesn't have to worry about whether the rent will be paid on time, where he can have his own room, where he can attend the best schools, and participate in activities that will help him reach his full potential. He painted a picture of his life that sounded like something from a parenting magazine. His house had a backyard with a swing set he'd never assembled, a playroom filled with educational toys he'd never supervised Marcus playing with, a schedule of enriching activities that existed only on paper. When Steinberg asked about his work schedule, Daniel spoke about flexibility and family time, conveniently omitting the 60-hour weeks and constant travel that had defined our relationship. "Ms. Rodriguez means well," Daniel continued, glancing at me with what looked like pity. "But she's young, inexperienced, and struggling financially. She works nights, which means Marcus is often cared for by her mother, who speaks limited English, or by neighbors who are essentially strangers. When I pick him up for visitation, he's often tired, sometimes dirty, and always asking when he can come to Daddy's house to stay." The lie hit me like a physical blow. Marcus had never asked to stay longer at Daniel's house. In fact, he usually cried when it was time to go, clinging to me like I might disappear if he let go. But who would believe the word of a struggling single mother against the sworn testimony of a successful businessman? Dr. Morrison took the stand next, her evaluation of our family delivered with clinical detachment. She had spent hours observing both households, interviewing Marcus, and analyzing our family dynamics. Her conclusions felt like a death sentence delivered in professional terminology. "Based on my observations," Dr. Morrison testified, "Marcus presents as a well-adjusted child who has clearly been loved by both parents. However, there are significant differences in the stability and structure of the two homes. Mr. Carlisle's residence provides consistency, routine, and age-appropriate activities. Ms. Rodriguez's home, while warm and loving, lacks the resources and stability that research shows are crucial for optimal child development." She spoke about educational opportunities, extracurricular activities, and social development, as if love was just one factor among many, no more important than the square footage of a house or the prestige of a zip code. When asked about Marcus's emotional state, she noted that he seemed somewhat anxious during transitions, but attributed this to the natural stress of a custody dispute rather than any specific concerns about either parent. "In cases like this," Dr. Morrison concluded, "the court must consider not just the present situation, but the future welfare of the child. Mr. Carlisle's resources, stability, and family support system provide Marcus with the best opportunity for long-term success and well-being." Sarah did her best during cross-examination, but Daniel's team had prepared for every angle. When she asked Patricia about Daniel's frequent absences during our relationship, Patricia claimed she had no knowledge of his work schedule. When she pressed Dr. Morrison about the importance of the mother-child bond, the psychologist acknowledged its significance but emphasized that fathers could provide equally important stability and structure. When it was our turn to present our case, Sarah called character witnesses who spoke about my dedication as a mother, my work ethic, my integrity. My mother, Carmen, took the stand in her best dress, her English carefully practiced but still accented with the rhythms of her childhood in Mexico. "Elena is the best mother I have ever seen," my mother testified, her voice strong despite her nervousness. "She works so hard, but never too hard for Marcus. She reads to him every night, sings to him when he's scared, takes him to the park even, when she's tired from working all night. She makes his breakfast every morning with little faces in the pancakes, teaches him Spanish so he knows where his family comes from, shows him every day that he is loved." But even my mother's heartfelt testimony felt small against the weight of Daniel's resources. When Steinberg cross-examined her, he gently but persistently highlighted the language barrier, the modest income, the differences in educational background and social status. He made her love sound quaint but insufficient, her influence a limitation, rather than a gift. My supervisor from the hospital, Maria Santos, testified about my dedication, my skill, my reliability. She spoke about how I'd never missed a shift without good reason, how patients specifically requested me, how I'd gone back to school to advance my nursing credentials while working full-time and raising a child alone. Elena Rodriguez is one of our finest nurses, Maria said firmly. She brings the same compassion and attention to detail to her work that she brings to parenting. I've seen her leave work exhausted and still light up when she talks about Marcus. That child is her whole world, and she is an exceptional mother. But again, Steinberg's cross-examination focused on the night shifts, the stress of my job, the physical and emotional demands of nursing that might impact my availability for Marcus. He made my career sound like a burden rather than a source of pride and financial independence. When I took the stand, I felt like I was fighting for my life, which, in every way that mattered, I was. Sarah guided me through my testimony, letting me tell my side of the story for the first time in months. I spoke about the bedtime routines that had never varied, the way I'd rearranged my entire life around Marcus's needs, the sacrifices I'd made gladly because being his mother was the greatest privilege of my life. I know I can't give Marcus a mansion or a trust fund, I said, looking directly at Judge Thornfield. But I can give him something more valuable, a mother who sees him, really sees him, every single day. I know that he likes his sandwiches cut diagonally, that he's afraid of the vacuum cleaner but pretends he's not, that he makes up songs when he thinks no one is listening. I know when he's getting sick before he does, when he needs comfort, before he asks for it, when he's proud of something before he shows me. I talked about our morning routine, how Marcus would climb into my bed after I got home from work and tell me about his dreams while I made funny voices for his stuffed animals. I described our weekend adventures, free activities that cost nothing but meant everything, trips to the library for story time, walks in the desert to collect interesting rocks, picnics in the park where we'd make up stories about the clouds. Being Marcus's mother isn't what I do, I concluded, my voice steadier than I felt. It's who I am. It's not a job or a responsibility. It's the greatest love I've ever known. And I believe that love, real love, is the foundation everything else is built on. Steinberg's cross-examination was brutal but polite, designed to expose every vulnerability without appearing to attack a grieving mother. He questioned my decision to work nights, suggesting it prioritized my career over Marcus's need for a present parent. He asked about my support system, implying that relying on my mother and neighbors was evidence of my inability to manage alone. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, his tone almost gentle, "you've spoken beautifully about your love for Marcus, and no one questions that love. But love doesn't pay for private school tuition or music lessons or college preparation. Can you honestly say that your current living situation provides Marcus with the same opportunities he would have in his father's home?" The question was designed to be unanswerable. Of course, I couldn't provide the same material advantages Daniel could offer. But I wanted to scream that Marcus needed more than opportunities. He needed to be cherished, understood, valued for who he was, rather than who he might become. After closing arguments, Judge Thornfield announced that she would take the matter under advisement and render her decision the following week. The waiting was torture, 7 days of sleepless nights, and anxious days, trying to maintain normalcy for Marcus while my world hung in the balance. Sarah tried to prepare me for the possibility of losing primary custody, explaining appeal processes and visitation modifications. But I could barely hear her over the roar of panic in my head. How do you explain to a 3-year-old that the system designed to protect him might tear him away from the only home he'd ever really known? The night before the decision, I lay in bed listening to Marcus's peaceful breathing from his toddler bed across the room. Our small apartment had never felt smaller, but it was filled with love in a way Daniel's sterile showcase never could be. Every inch of our space told the story of our life together. Finger paintings on the refrigerator, books scattered everywhere, toys that had been loved until they were threadbare. I thought about all the moments that had led us here, all the choices that had seemed so clear at the time, but had somehow resulted in this impossible situation. I had loved a man who was incapable of loving me back, trusted someone who saw relationships as transactions, believed in a future that existed only in my imagination. But I had also gained something precious from that broken relationship. Marcus, my beautiful boy who had taught me that love wasn't about being chosen by someone else, but about choosing to love completely, unconditionally, with every fiber of your being. Whatever happened in that courtroom, Daniel could never take away the 3 years of midnight feedings and first steps, bedtime stories and scraped knee kisses, the daily miracle of watching a tiny human grow into his own amazing self. The morning of the decision, I dressed Marcus in his favorite dinosaur shirt and told him we were going to see the nice judge lady one more time. He asked if Daddy would be there, and when I said yes, he nodded solemnly like he was processing something important. "Mommy," he said as I buckled him into his car seat, "I don't want to live at Daddy's house all the time." My heart stopped. "Why not, baby?" "Because his house doesn't smell like home," Marcus said simply, "and he doesn't know my bedtime songs." I drove to the courthouse with tears streaming down my face, not from sadness but from the overwhelming knowledge that my son understood something the adults in his life had been debating for months. Home wasn't about square footage or zip codes. It was about feeling safe, known, and unconditionally loved. As we walked into that courthouse for what I thought might be the last time as a family, I had no idea that Marcus was about to teach everyone in that room exactly what home really meant. I had no idea that my 3-year-old son was about to find his voice in a way that would leave even Judge Thornfield speechless. Sometimes the most profound truths come from the smallest voices, and sometimes justice arrives in the most unexpected packages. What happened next would remind everyone present that in matters of the heart, children often see more clearly than the adults making decisions about their lives. The day Judge Thornfield was scheduled to announce her decision dawned gray and heavy, the kind of Phoenix morning where the desert clouds gathered like they were holding their breath. I had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and listening to Marcus's steady breathing, memorizing the sound in case it was one of our last nights together in our little apartment. Marcus woke up unusually quiet, sensing the weight of the day, even though I'd tried to shield him from the adult complexities that were about to reshape his world. He ate his breakfast slowly, asking thoughtful questions that seemed far too mature for a 3-year-old. "Mommy, why do grown-ups have to decide where kids live?" he asked, pushing his cereal around in his bowl. "Can't kids just stay where they're happy?" The innocence of his question broke my heart. How do you explain to a child that sometimes the world operates on logic that has nothing to do with love? That decisions about families are made by strangers, in rooms filled with legal precedents instead of bedtime stories? "Sometimes grown-ups need help figuring out what's best," I said carefully, kneeling beside his chair. "But no matter what happens today, you are loved more than all the stars in the sky, okay?" He nodded solemnly, then surprised me by wrapping his small arms around my neck. "I love you more than all the dinosaurs that ever lived," he whispered, using our special way of measuring the unmeasurable. At the courthouse, the same cast of characters assembled for what felt like the final act of a play I never wanted to be in. Daniel sat with his legal team, looking confident and relaxed, occasionally checking his phone like this was just another business meeting. His parents had come for moral support, dressed in their country club finest, radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from never having to question their place in the world. Sarah squeezed my hand as we took our seats. "Remember," she whispered, "no matter what happens, this isn't the end. We have options, appeals, modifications. Your relationship with Marcus doesn't depend on what happens in this room." But it felt like everything depended on what happened in this room. 3 years of love, sacrifice, and devotion reduced to a legal decision based on income statements and zip codes. I watched Judge Thornfield review her notes one final time, her expression giving away nothing about the verdict that would determine my son's future. "Before I announce my decision," Judge Thornfield began, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years on the bench, "I want to acknowledge how difficult this case has been. Both parents clearly love their child, and both have valid concerns about his welfare. These are never easy decisions, but they are necessary ones." She paused, looking directly at Marcus, who was sitting quietly between a court-appointed advocate and a child psychologist, coloring in a dinosaur book, but obviously listening to every word. "However," the judge continued, "I've decided that I would like to hear from Marcus himself before I render my final decision. While 3 years old is quite young, this child has demonstrated remarkable maturity throughout this process, and I believe his voice should be heard." My heart stopped. Sarah grabbed my arm, her surprise matching my own. Child testimony in Doe. Custody cases was rare, especially for someone so young, but Judge Thornfield had a reputation for unconventional approaches when she felt they served justice. Daniel's legal team immediately objected, arguing that a 3-year-old couldn't possibly understand the implications of his statements, that leading questions could manipulate his responses, that exposing him to this kind of pressure was potentially harmful. But Judge Thornfield overruled them with a firmness that suggested she'd already considered these concerns. "I'm not asking this child to choose between his parents," she said clearly. "I'm asking him to help me understand his world, his feelings, his needs. Children often see things adults miss, and in a case this close, his perspective could be invaluable." The court was rearranged so Marcus could sit in a special chair that had been brought in just for him, one that allowed him to see everyone while feeling secure. A child psychologist sat nearby to monitor his emotional state, ready to intervene if the questioning became too stressful. Judge Thornfield approached him with the gentle authority of someone who had spent years talking to children in difficult circumstances. She knelt down to his level, speaking in a warm voice that somehow managed to fill the entire courtroom. "Hi, Marcus. My name is Judge Thornfield, but you can call me Judge Maggie if that's easier. I'm the person who helps families figure out the best place for children to live and be happy. Can you tell me your name?" "Marcus Rodriguez Carlisle," he said clearly, his small voice carrying surprising confidence. "I'm 3 years old, and I'll be 4 on October 15th. "That's wonderful, Marcus. You're a very smart boy. Now, I want you to know that there are no wrong answers to my questions, okay? I just want to understand how you feel about some things." Marcus nodded, his hands folded in his lap like he'd been preparing for this moment his entire short life. "Can you tell me about your home with Mommy?" Judge Thornfield asked. Marcus's face lit up with the kind of joy that comes from talking about something you love completely. "We live in an apartment that's just the right size for us. My bed is next to Mommy's bed, and when I have bad dreams, she lets me climb in with her, and she sings the dinosaur song until I'm not scared anymore." He went on to describe our life with the detailed observation of a child who had been paying attention to everything. He talked about our morning routine, how I would make him breakfast with funny faces in the pancakes, how we would sit on the floor and read books together before I had to sleep after working all night. "Mommy works at the hospital to help sick people feel better," Marcus explained to the judge with obvious pride. "She wears special clothes called scrubs, and sometimes she's really tired when she comes home, but she always has time to play with me and ask about my day." Judge Thornfield asked about his father's house, and Marcus's description was equally detailed but notably different in tone. He spoke about the big backyard, the nice toys, the swimming pool that was too deep for him to use without supervision, that never seemed to be available. "Daddy's house is really big," Marcus said thoughtfully. "It has lots of rooms, but most of them are for looking at, not for playing in. Daddy says I have to be careful not to mess anything up because everything is expensive." The courtroom was completely silent as this 3-year-old boy painted a picture of two very different worlds with the honesty that only children possess. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone or play favorites. He was simply describing his reality, with the clarity of someone too young to understand the need for diplomatic answers. "Marcus," Judge Thornfield said gently, "when you're at Daddy's house, how do you feel?" Marcus considered this question seriously, his little brow furrowed in concentration. "I feel like I'm visiting," he said finally, "like when we go to Grandma Carmen's house for dinner, and she says don't touch anything because it's for special occasions. It's nice, but it's not. It's not home." "And how do you feel at Mommy's house?" "Like myself," Marcus said immediately. "Like I can ask questions and make messes and be loud when I'm happy and cry when I'm sad, and Mommy will still love me the same amount." Daniel's face had gone pale, and I could see his lawyers exchanging concerned glances. This wasn't going the way they had expected. Judge Thornfield asked about daily routines, and Marcus described in vivid detail how different his life was in each household. At my apartment, he talked about helping me fold laundry while we watched cartoons, about bath time when I would make mohawks with his hair and let him splash until the floor was soaked, about bedtime stories where I did different voices for all the characters and sometimes made up new endings if the regular ones were too scary. At Daniel's house, he described structured meal times where he had to sit properly and eat what was served, supervised play periods where an expensive nanny monitored his activities, and bedtime routines that involved reading from approved educational books and lights out at exactly 8 o'clock. "Marcus," the judge said, "both your parents love you very much. Can you tell me how you know Mommy loves you?" "She knows things about me that nobody else knows," Marcus said without hesitation. "Like how I don't like it when foods touch each other on my plate, so she puts everything in separate little bowls. And she knows that I get scared during thunderstorms. So she lets me help her count the seconds between the lightning and the thunder until it goes away. And she knows that I don't like the dark, so she leaves the bathroom light on with the door cracked open just enough to make a little light stripe on my wall." He paused, thinking, then added, "And when I ask her questions, she always tells me the truth, even when the truth is sad or hard. She says kids deserve to know what's really happening, just in words they can understand." "And how do you know Daddy loves you?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to find words for something he felt but couldn't quite articulate. "Daddy buys me things," he said finally. "Nice toys and clothes and stuff. And he takes pictures of me to show people. And he says I'm smart and handsome and that I'm going to be successful like him when I grow up." The difference in his descriptions was heartbreaking. Love measured by attention versus love measured by acquisition. Love that saw him as he was versus love that projected what he might become. Judge Thornfield asked one final question. One that would later be quoted in family law textbooks as an example of how children's voices could illuminate truths that adult analysis missed. "Marcus, if you could have anything in the whole world, what would make you happiest?" I expected him to ask for toys or trips, or the kind of material things that 3-year-olds usually dream about. Instead, Marcus looked directly at me, then at his father, then back at the judge. "I want to live where people love me for who I am right now, not for who they want me to be when I grow up," he said with a clarity that left the entire courtroom speechless. "I want to live where I can ask for help when I'm scared and someone will come right away, not when it's convenient. I want to live where I matter more than furniture or schedules or what other people think." He paused, then added with the devastating honesty of childhood, "I want to live where home feels like love, not like a test I might fail." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Thornfield sat back in her chair, clearly moved by what she had just heard. Daniel stared at his son like he was seeing him for the first time, and I could see something cracking in his perfectly composed facade. "Thank you, Marcus," Judge Thornfield said softly. "You've been very brave and very helpful. You can go sit with Ms. Anderson now while I make my decision." As Marcus was led back to his seat, he caught my eye and smiled, a small, confident smile that said he knew he had told the truth and that was enough. In that moment, I realized my 3-year-old son had just done something I had been unable to do through months of legal battles. He had shown everyone exactly what love looked like from a child's perspective. Judge Thornfield called for a brief recess to consider what she had heard, and I watched Daniel across the aisle. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he looked uncertain, shaken by his son's words in a way that legal arguments and expert testimony hadn't managed to achieve. When court resumed, Judge Thornfield's demeanor had shifted. She looked directly at both parents as she began to speak, her voice carrying a weight that suggested this decision had challenged everything she thought she knew about determining a child's best interests. "In 30 years on this bench," she began, "I have rarely encountered a case that has forced me to examine so carefully the difference between what looks good on paper and what actually serves a child's emotional and psychological welfare. This case has been a profound reminder that children are not possessions to be awarded based on financial capability, but human beings whose voices and needs must be heard and honored." She went on to discuss how Marcus's testimony had illuminated aspects of both households that expert evaluations had missed, how his emotional intelligence and articulate expression of his needs had provided insights that no amount of professional assessment could capture. "While Mr. Carlisle can undoubtedly provide material advantages and educational opportunities," Judge Thornfield continued, "it has become clear that Ms. Rodriguez provides something equally valuable and arguably more crucial during these formative years, a home where this child feels unconditionally loved, emotionally safe, and free to develop his authentic self." I felt tears streaming down my face as the judge's words sank in, but I didn't dare believe what I was hearing until she made it official. "Therefore, I am awarding primary physical custody to Ms. Elena Rodriguez, with generous visitation rights for Mr. Carlisle. However, I am also ordering family counseling for all parties to help develop a co-parenting relationship that serves Marcus's best interests." The gavel came down with a sound that echoed through my entire being, and I realized I had been holding my breath for months. Marcus was coming home with me, not because I had won a legal battle, but because his own voice had cut through all the noise and reminded everyone what really mattered. As we left the courtroom that day, Marcus slipped his small hand into mine and looked up with eyes that held wisdom far beyond his years. "Mommy," he said, "I told them the truth like you taught me. Was that okay?" I knelt down and pulled him into a hug that tried to contain all the love and pride and relief I felt. In that moment, "That was perfect, baby. You were perfect." And you know what? The truth always finds a way to shine through, especially when it comes from someone brave enough to speak it. The weeks following the custody decision felt like waking up from a nightmare that had lasted so long I'd forgotten what normal felt like. Marcus and I returned to our little apartment with a new sense of security. But more than that, with a profound understanding of our own strength that neither of us had fully grasped before. The first thing I did was frame Marcus's favorite drawing, a crayon masterpiece he'd created during one of our weekend art sessions. It showed our apartment with a rainbow over it and 2 stick figures holding hands, one tall, one small, both smiling impossibly wide grins. I hung it in our kitchen where we could see it every morning, a daily reminder that home wasn't measured in square footage, but in the size of the love that filled it. But the real transformation began when I realized that surviving this battle had awakened something in both of us that went far beyond simply winning custody. Marcus had discovered his voice in that courtroom, and I had rediscovered mine. We had learned that speaking truth with courage could move mountains, even when those mountains were built from legal precedents and social expectations. The mandatory family counseling sessions that Judge Thornfield had ordered turned out to be one of the most unexpected gifts of this entire ordeal. Dr. Patricia Reeves was a family therapist who specialized in high-conflict divorces, and she had a way of cutting through pretense that made everyone in the room uncomfortable in the most necessary ways. During our first session, Daniel arrived 15 minutes late, checking his phone and apologizing with the kind of casual dismissiveness that suggested his time was more valuable than everyone else's. Marcus sat between us on Dr. Reeves's couch, coloring in a book, but clearly listening to every word with the heightened awareness of a child who had learned that adult conversations often determined his fate. "Daniel," Dr. Reeves said after the preliminary introductions, "Marcus testified that he feels like he's visiting when he's at your house rather than truly being at home. Can you help me understand what that might mean from his perspective?" Daniel's immediate response was defensive, listing all the material advantages his home provided: the bigger bedroom, the better toys, the educational opportunities. But Dr. Reeves gently redirected him. "I'm not questioning the quality of your home or your love for Marcus," she said. "I'm asking you to consider what might make a 3-year-old feel like a guest rather than a family member in his father's house." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I watched Daniel struggle with it in a way that was both painful and hopeful. For the first time since I'd known him, he was being asked to see the world through someone else's eyes rather than simply asserting his own perspective. Marcus, meanwhile, had stopped coloring and was watching his father with the intense focus he reserved for moments when he was trying to understand something important. Finally, he spoke up in his clear, small voice. "Daddy, remember when I spilled juice on the white couch and you got really upset? You said it was expensive and I needed to be more careful. But when I spill things at Mommy's house, she just says, 'Accidents happen and we clean it up together.'" The simplicity of the observation hit like a lightning bolt. Daniel stared at his son, and I could see the moment when understanding began to dawn. His house wasn't unwelcoming because it was large or expensive. It was unwelcoming because it prioritized objects over people, perfection over comfort. Over the following weeks, something remarkable began to happen. Daniel started really listening to Marcus during their visits, asking questions about his son's feelings rather than just about his activities. He began to understand that being a father meant more than providing opportunities. It meant creating emotional safety. The change wasn't immediate or complete, but it was real. Daniel rearranged his pristine living room to include a designated play area where Marcus could make messes without judgment. He started asking about Marcus's day in detail, listening to stories about playground friendships and favorite books with the kind of attention he'd previously reserved for business meetings. Most importantly, he began to see me not as an adversary, to be defeated, but as a partner in raising the child we both loved. During one particularly productive counseling session, he looked directly at me and said something I never thought I'd hear. "Elena, I owe you an apology. Not just for what I said that night, but for everything. I was so focused on winning this custody battle that I forgot we were supposed to be on the same team, Marcus's team." The apology didn't erase the pain he had caused or the months of legal warfare we'd endured, but it opened a door to a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than conflict. We began to coordinate Marcus's care in ways that actually served his needs instead of our egos. But the most profound changes were happening in Marcus himself. The little boy who had found his voice in Judge Thornfield's courtroom continued to speak with a confidence and clarity that amazed everyone around him. His teachers at preschool noticed it first, how he advocated for himself when other children were unkind, how he helped resolve conflicts between classmates with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. One afternoon, Marcus came home from school with a story that perfectly captured how much he had grown. A new student had been crying during lunch because the other children were teasing him about his accent. Instead of ignoring the situation or telling a teacher, Marcus had walked over and sat with the boy. "I told him that my grandma Carmen talks different too, and that different voices make the world more interesting," Marcus explained to me as we prepared dinner together. Then I asked him to teach me a word in his language, and pretty soon other kids wanted to learn words too. As he spoke, I realized that my son had internalized the most important lesson from our entire ordeal: that differences should be celebrated, rather than criticized, that speaking up for yourself and others was not just acceptable, but necessary, and that love comes in many forms, but always requires courage. The ripple effects of our experience extended far beyond our immediate family. Sarah Chen, my attorney, asked if I would be willing to speak at family law conferences about the importance of children's voices in custody proceedings. What started as a single presentation turned into a speaking tour that took me across the country, sharing Marcus's story with judges, lawyers, and families going through similar battles. At first, I was terrified of public speaking. The idea of standing in front of rooms full of legal professionals and sharing our most vulnerable moments felt overwhelming. But Marcus, who was now 4 and had developed an uncanny ability to sense, when I needed encouragement, gave me the push I needed. "Mommy," he said one evening as I practiced my first speech in our living room, "remember when I was scared to talk to the judge lady, but you said sometimes we have to be brave to help other people?" His words reminded me that this wasn't about my comfort. It was about making sure other children and families had the chance to be heard the way we had been. That first speech was shaky and emotional, but the response was overwhelming. Judges approached me afterward to say that hearing our story had changed how they approached child custody cases. Lawyers shared that they were beginning to advocate more strongly for their young clients' voices to be heard. Most meaningfully, other mothers reached out to tell me that our story had given them hope during their own custody battles. They shared their fears about not having enough money or the right zip code, about being judged for working night shifts or living in apartments instead of houses. I began to understand that our experience had touched on something much larger than one family's struggle. It had highlighted how often the legal system conflated material advantages with good parenting. This realization led to the creation of something I never could have imagined: the Marcus Voice Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to ensuring that children's perspectives are heard and valued in family court proceedings. What started as my desire to help other families grew into a movement that has changed how custody cases are approached in courts across the country. The foundation provides training for judges and attorneys on age-appropriate ways to gather children's input, funds child advocates for families who can't afford them, and creates resources to help parents understand that children's emotional needs are just as important as their material ones. We've helped implement new protocols in family courts that prioritize children's voices while protecting them from undue pressure or manipulation. Marcus, now 5 and starting kindergarten, has become an unofficial spokesperson for the foundation. He doesn't understand all the legal complexities, but he understands the core message: that kids deserve to be heard, that families come in all shapes and sizes, and that love is more important than luxury. During one foundation event, a little girl approached Marcus after I finished speaking. She was about his age, with pigtails and a shy smile, and she whispered something in his ear that made him nod seriously. "What did she say?" I asked him. "Later." "She said her mommy and daddy are fighting about where she should live, and she's scared nobody will ask her what she wants," Marcus replied. "I told her that grown-ups sometimes forget to ask kids important questions, but that doesn't mean her feelings don't matter. I told her to be brave like we were." Watching my son comfort another child facing similar struggles filled me with a pride so deep it brought tears to my eyes. This little boy who had once been a pawn in an adult conflict had become a voice for other children experiencing the same fear and uncertainty. Our relationship with Daniel continued to evolve in ways that surprised all of us. The man who had once dismissed me as an unfit mother began to see my strengths not as threats to his authority, but as assets to our son's development. He started asking for my advice about Marcus's emotional needs, acknowledging that my nursing background and natural intuition gave me insights he had missed. During one of our regular co-parenting check-ins, Daniel said something that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. "Elena, I need to tell you something. Watching you build this foundation Seeing how you've turned our pain into purpose, it's made me realize what an incredible mother you are. Marcus is lucky to have you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see that. The acknowledgement meant more than any court victory ever could. It wasn't just vindication. It was recognition of the truth that Marcus had spoken so clearly in that courtroom. That good parenting isn't about what you can buy, but about how you love. But perhaps the most powerful transformation has been in my own sense of self-worth. For years, I had allowed other people's opinions to define my value as a mother and as a woman. Daniel's cruel words had wounded me so deeply because part of me had feared they might be true. The custody battle had forced me to examine my own beliefs about success, worth, and what it means to be enough. Through counseling, speaking engagements, and countless conversations with other parents facing similar struggles, I learned that my love for Marcus, my dedication to his well-being, and my willingness to fight for what was right were not just enough. They were extraordinary. I learned that working night shifts to support my family wasn't a sign of failure, but a testament to my commitment. I learned that living in a small apartment where love flourished was infinitely better than residing in a mansion where souls withered. Most importantly, I learned that Marcus's voice in that courtroom hadn't just saved our family, it had revealed a truth that extends far beyond custody battles. Children see clearly because they haven't yet learned to prioritize appearance over authenticity, status over love, material success over emotional connection. When we listen to them, really listen, they can teach us profound lessons about what truly matters. The evening Marcus turned 5, we had a small celebration in our apartment with my mother, a few close friends, and even Daniel, who brought a thoughtful gift and stayed for cake. As I watched my son blow out his candles, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 2 years earlier, I had been a broken woman convinced I wasn't good enough to keep her child. Tonight, I was a confident mother, advocate, and speaker who had discovered that her voice, and her son's voice, could change the world, one family at a time. After the guests left and Marcus was tucked into bed, he called me back to his room for one more story. As I sat beside him in the soft glow of his nightlight, he looked up at me with those wise eyes that had seen too much too early, but had somehow retained their innocence. "Mommy," he said, "I'm glad we were brave in the big room with the judge lady." "Me too, baby. You were the bravest person I've ever known." "But you know what I'm most glad about?" "What's that?" "That we showed everybody that love is the most important thing, and that kids' voices matter too." As I kissed his forehead and whispered goodnight, I realized that this little boy had summarized in a few simple sentences what I'd been trying to articulate in speeches and presentations across the country. Love is the most important thing. Children's voices matter, and sometimes the smallest people among us are the ones with the biggest truths to tell. If you're reading this story and you're facing your own battles, whether in courtroom or in life, remember that your voice matters too. Remember that love expressed authentically is always more powerful than performance masked as perfection. Remember that children see truth with clarity that we adults often lose in our pursuit of what looks right instead of what feels right. Your story might not end in a courtroom, but it can end with victory. Victory over voices that tell you you're not enough. Victory over systems that value wealth over worth. Victory over anyone who tries to silence the truth you carry in your heart. Marcus taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's speaking truth despite the fear. It's standing up for what's right, even when you're the smallest person in the room. It's believing that love, real love, will always find a way to shine through the darkness. And sometimes, just sometimes, that love speaks through the voice of a child who refuses to let the grown-ups get it wrong. That voice can change everything. One honest word, one brave moment, one unshakable truth at a time. If this story has moved you, if you found strength in Marcus's courage or hope in our journey, I encourage you to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below about your own experiences with finding your voice, standing up for truth, or overcoming systems that seemed stacked against you. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find their own courage. Remember, you are more than their opinions, stronger than their doubts, and worthy of a love that sees you exactly as you are. Sometimes it takes a child to remind us of these truths, but once we hear them, we never forget. Stay strong, speak truth, and never underestimate the power of a voice that refuses to be silenced. The Marcus Voice Foundation grew beyond anything I could have imagined when I first started speaking at those family law conferences. What began as sharing our story to help a few families evolved into a national movement that fundamentally changed how children's voices are heard in legal proceedings. By Marcus's 6th birthday, we had advocates in 43 states, had trained over 2,000 judges and attorneys, and had directly impacted the outcomes of more than 10,000 custody cases. But the real magic happened in the smaller moments, the individual lives that were transformed when children finally felt safe enough to speak their truth. I received letters weekly from families across the country, each one a testament to the ripple effect that Marcus's courage had created. One letter particularly stayed with me. It came from a 9-year-old girl named Sophia in Oregon, whose parents were battling over custody. After learning about our foundation through her court-appointed advocate, Sophia found the courage to tell the judge that she didn't want to live with her father full-time because he spent more time on his phone than talking to her. Her honesty led to a custody arrangement that prioritized quality time over quantity, and her father enrolled in parenting classes to learn how to truly connect with his daughter. "Dear Marcus," Sophia had written in crayon, "thank you for showing grown-ups that kids know important things too. Now my daddy puts his phone away when we're together, and we play board games, and he listens to my stories about school. You helped my family remember how to love each other better." Marcus, who was now reading at a 3rd grade level despite being in 1st grade, read Sophia's letter aloud to me one evening after dinner. When he finished, he looked up with the same serious expression he'd worn in Judge Thornfield's courtroom. "Mommy, are there lots of kids like Sophia who need help talking to grown-ups?" "Yes, baby. More than we can even count." "Then we need to help more of them," he said with the matter-of-fact determination that had become his trademark. "Kids shouldn't have to be scared to tell the truth." That conversation sparked the next evolution of our foundation, the development of age-appropriate resources that helped children understand their rights in family situations and gave them tools to express their feelings safely. We created coloring books that taught kids about different family structures, picture books that showed children advocating for themselves, and even a children's podcast where Marcus interviewed other kids who had navigated difficult family transitions. The podcast, Marcus Asks, became unexpectedly popular. Marcus's natural curiosity and genuine empathy made him a gifted interviewer, and children responded to him in ways they never would with adult hosts. He asked questions that adults wouldn't think to ask, like, "What does home smell like to you?" And "If you could make one rule for all families, what would it be?" One episode featured 8-year-old David, whose parents had divorced when he was 5. David shared how he'd created a travel bag that went between his mom's and dad's houses, filled with items that made both places feel like home, a favorite. Blanket, photos of both parents, and a small stuffed elephant named Hope. "The hard part isn't having 2 houses," David explained to Marcus with remarkable wisdom. "The hard part is when your parents forget that you love them both, and you don't want to choose sides. My travel bag reminds me that I can take love with me wherever I go." Marcus listened intently, then asked, "What would you tell other kids whose parents are getting divorced?" "That it's not your fault, and it's okay to feel sad and confused, but you can still love both your parents, and they can both love you, even if they can't love each other anymore. And sometimes, having 2 homes means you get twice as much love." These conversations weren't just healing for the children who participated, they were educational for the adults who listened. Parents began to understand how divorce looked through their children's eyes, how seemingly small gestures could provide enormous comfort. and how honest communication could reduce anxiety and confusion. The success of the podcast led to opportunities I never could have imagined. We were invited to testify before congressional committees about children's rights in family court. Major universities began incorporating our materials into their law school curricula. Child psychology programs started using our case study as an example of how children's voices could be ethically and effectively included in legal proceedings. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Judge Margaret Thornfield, now nearing retirement, invited Marcus and me to speak at her final judicial conference. Standing before an audience of family court judges from across the western United States, she introduced us as the family that reminded me why I became a judge in the first place. 35 years ago, I entered family law because I believed the legal system could protect children and strengthen families, Judge Thornfield told the assembled judges. But somewhere along the way, I began to prioritize procedure over people, precedent over truth. Elena and Marcus Rodriguez reminded me that children are not just subjects of our decisions. They are human beings with valuable perspectives that can illuminate truths we might otherwise miss. She went on to share how our case had influenced her approach to every subsequent custody hearing, how she had implemented new protocols in her courtroom to ensure children's voices were heard, and how those changes had led to better outcomes for families. Marcus taught me that wisdom doesn't correlate with age, she concluded, and that sometimes the most profound truths come from the smallest voices. These two have changed not just how I practice law, but how I understand the meaning of justice itself. When it was my turn to speak, I looked out at the sea of judges, people who held the power to shape children's lives with their decisions, and felt the weight of responsibility for every family who might benefit from what we'd learned. 5 years ago, I stood in a courtroom convinced I was going to lose my son because I couldn't compete with luxury cars and country club memberships, I began. I thought good parenting was measured by bank account balances and zip codes, but my 3-year-old son taught me and taught all of you that children evaluate love differently than adults do. I shared the lessons we'd learned through our foundation work. That children prioritize emotional safety over material advantage, that they can distinguish between being wanted and being truly seen, and that they often possess wisdom about family. Dynamics that adults miss because we're too focused on winning arguments rather than understanding needs. When we listen to children, really listen, they tell us what they need to thrive, I continued. They don't ask for perfection. They ask for presence. They don't need endless opportunities. They need unconditional love. They don't require elaborate explanations. They require honest truth told in ways they can understand. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus himself took the microphone. Now 6 years old and comfortable with public speaking, he addressed the room of judges with the same clarity that had left Judge Thornfield speechless years earlier. "Hi, judge people," he began, earning chuckles from the audience. "My mom says, you help decide where kids should live when their parents can't agree. That's a really important job, so I want to tell you some things that might help." He spoke without notes, his small voice carrying through the auditorium as he shared insights that legal textbooks couldn't capture. Kids know more than grown-ups think we do. We know when someone is really listening to us or just pretending. We know when someone loves us for who we are or for who they want us to be. We know the difference between a house that looks pretty and a home that feels safe. He paused, looking around the room with the confidence of someone who had learned that truth was more powerful than fear. Sometimes grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be. Kids don't care if their room is big or small. We care if someone tucks us in at night. We don't care if we have fancy toys. We care if someone plays with us. We don't care if our clothes are expensive. We care if someone notices when we're sad and helps us feel better. The room was completely silent. 200 experienced judges hanging on every word from a 6-year-old boy who had become an unlikely expert on family dynamics. When you're trying to decide where a kid should live, maybe you could ask us what makes us feel loved instead of just looking at which house is bigger. Because love isn't about money. Love is about paying attention. And kids always know when someone is really paying attention to us. The standing ovation that followed lasted 5 full minutes, but I could see that the applause wasn't just appreciation, it was recognition. These judges understood that they had just heard something that would change how they approached their most difficult cases. After the conference, something remarkable happened. Judges began reaching out to us directly, asking for consultation on particularly challenging cases. They wanted guidance on how to create child-friendly environments in their courtrooms, how to ask questions that elicited honest responses rather than coached answers, and how to evaluate testimony from children without putting undue pressure on them. This led to the development of our Child Voice Protocols, a comprehensive guide that has been adopted by family courts nationwide. The protocols outline best practices for including children's perspectives in custody proceedings, from physical courtroom modifications that make children feel safe to interview techniques that respect developmental limitations while gathering meaningful input. One particularly innovative program we developed was the Family Story Project, where children create visual representations of their experiences, drawings, photo collages, even short videos, that help judges understand their perspectives without requiring formal testimony. 7-year-old Emma from Colorado drew a picture of herself as a bridge between 2 houses, with the caption, "I help my parents remember to be kind to each other." Her artwork became evidence in her custody case and led to a co-parenting arrangement that emphasized collaboration over conflict. The ripple effects extended beyond legal proceedings. Pediatricians began using our materials to help identify children experiencing family stress. School counselors incorporated our approaches to help students navigate family transitions. Even corporate family support programs started acknowledging that employee well-being was directly connected to their children's emotional security. But the work wasn't without challenges. We faced criticism from some legal traditionalists who argued that including children's voices in custody proceedings was manipulative or potentially harmful. Some parents accused us of coaching children to say what we wanted to hear. A few high-profile cases where our recommendations weren't followed led to negative media coverage questioning whether children were mature enough to understand the implications of their preferences. Each criticism was an opportunity to refine our approach and strengthen our advocacy. We developed strict ethical guidelines for our work, created oversight committees to ensure our methods remained child-centered rather than outcome-driven, and established partnerships with child psychologists and social workers to monitor the emotional impact of our interventions. Most importantly, we never lost sight of our core mission, ensuring that children's voices were heard, valued, and protected. Every decision we made was filtered through the simple question Marcus had posed years earlier in that courtroom. What makes a kid feel loved? By the time Marcus turned 7, our foundation had grown into an international organization. We were consulted on family law reform in 12 countries, had trained advocates who spoke 17 different languages, and had developed culturally sensitive materials that respected diverse family structures and traditions. The boy who had once spoken truth to power in a Phoenix courtroom was now inspiring children around the world to find their own voices. We received artwork from children in Japan, letters from kids in Brazil, and video messages from young advocates in South Africa who were adapting our materials for their own communities. One particularly moving correspondence came from a 10-year-old girl named Amara in Kenya, whose traditional community was grappling with how to honor children's perspectives while respecting cultural practices around family structure. "Dear Marcus," she wrote, "in my village, children are supposed to listen to adults, not speak to them about important things. But after my teacher shared your story, I found courage to tell my grandmother how I felt when my parents argued. She listened to me, and now our family meetings include time for children to share our feelings too. You helped my whole village learn that respecting elders and hearing children can happen at the same time." These global connections reinforced something we had learned early in our work: The desire to be heard, understood, and valued transcends cultural boundaries. Children everywhere want the same fundamental things: to feel safe, to be loved unconditionally, and to know that their feelings matter to the adults making decisions about their lives. As our work expanded internationally, Marcus began to understand the broader implications of his childhood courage. During one of our evening conversations, he reflected on how his voice had created space for thousands of other children to speak their truth. "Mommy, remember when I was little and I talked to that judge lady?" "Of course I remember, baby. You were incredibly brave." "I didn't know then that other kids were watching or that what I said would help so many families. I was just scared and wanted to tell the truth." "That's exactly why it worked," I told him. "You weren't trying to impress anyone or say what you thought people wanted to hear. You just spoke from your heart." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's the most important thing we teach kids through our foundation, that their truth matters even when they're scared, especially when they're scared." At 7 years old, Marcus had articulated something that family law experts had been trying to understand for decades. Authentic voice carries more weight than practiced presentation, and children's intuitive understanding of love and safety often surpasses adults' analytical approach to family dynamics. Our story had begun with a broken family, a custody battle, and a little boy who found his voice in a moment of crisis. But it had evolved into something much larger, a movement that recognized children as complete human beings with valuable perspectives, not just subjects of adult decisions. Every day brought new reminders of the impact we were having. Former clients would send updates about their thriving families. Judges would share stories about how our protocols had helped them make better decisions. Other children would reach out to tell Marcus how his courage had inspired their own. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of our success was the simple fact that Marcus continued to be exactly who he had always been: curious, compassionate, honest, and brave. Despite all the attention and accolades, he remained a kid who loved dinosaurs and art projects, who asked thoughtful questions and gave generous hugs, who saw the best in people and spoke truth with love. The foundation had grown beyond our family, but its heart remained rooted in the simple truth that Marcus had spoken in Judge Thornfield's courtroom. Children deserve to be heard, families deserve to be healed, and love, real, authentic, unconditional love, is the foundation upon which everything else should be built. As we looked toward the future, I knew our work was far from over. There were still children who needed advocates, families who needed healing, and systems that needed reform. But I also knew that we had already accomplished something extraordinary. We had proven that the smallest voices could create the biggest changes, and that courage, once discovered, has the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire systems of justice. The little boy who had once been caught between two homes had become a bridge builder for thousands of families worldwide. And in helping others find their voices, he had shown me that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning battles, but from transforming them into opportunities for healing, growth, and lasting change. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.